higher education challenges, and it's a question on everyone's lips, and I think there's no more appropriate place to be addressing that here at one of the few conferences in higher education which aims to service both universities and the non-university part of the sector. So here we are all here, and we are going to look at this fairly tough area. Now, as you can see on the screen, this is our panel. And we have Natasha Abrahams, who is here representing postgraduate students as the General Secretary of the Council of Australian Postgraduate Associations. And I hope you can hear me now, and I hope you had not missed out on too much of what I said earlier. We have Kate Carnell, AO, who is the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. And I should just mention in passing that Kate really knows a lot about small business, because many years ago, before she had become the Chief Minister of the ACT, she was the pharmacist in the Canberra area of Red Hill. We have Mark Paterson, AO, who is the CEO of the Australian Skills Quality Agency. No, I'm sorry, that's the authority. Mark carries authority in this area. And finally, we have Dom Szambowski, who is the CEO of the International College of Management, and who brings a very interesting perspective from the non-university side of the sector. And Kate, let me start with you, because you also were previously the chief of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and you know from the employer side what employers are seeking in a higher education graduate. So are we doing the right thing now, or are there gaps that need to be filled?
Look, there's some incredibly good things that are happening, there's no doubt, whether it be in the vocational training space or universities or wherever. The problem that employers will tell you every day of the week is that many of the people who are graduates, and we'll speak broadly about from where, are not work ready. So they turn up with a degree or with a qualification, but they're not in a position to be able to, I suppose, utilise that piece of paper, shall we say, in a way that is productive in the workplace. So lots of employers would say, you know, the great dilemma here is that the skills that many institutions train people with do not include being work ready or able to utilise those skills in an appropriate fashion. And I'll just use an example. As you heard, I'm a pharmacist. I own my own pharmacies for many, many years. Now, you can be the best pharmacist technically in the world and the worst pharmacist in the world if you can't communicate. The olden days of pharmacy, where you stood behind a bench and typed labels or put information into computers, are gone. The job is about being able to communicate your knowledge in the drug space, in drug interaction, in health space, with patients and consumers. So there's some skill sets that need to be there to make you job ready, and that's what employers complain about every day of the week.
Yes. Well, as we heard from Peter Coldrake, universities are changing, aren't they? There's a much more emphasis on those type of skills now than there had been 10 years ago.
Possibly. And some universities are doing it a whole lot better than others. Right. So there's a number of universities now that are saying, well, we will make sure that all of our graduates have some workplace experience, some internships, some actual experience out there in the workplace before they graduate. What a great idea. But there's still a lot that don't.
Would you care to name those universities?
I think QUT does a great job. The University of Canberra's announced those things. Look, there's a chunk in that space, so it would be wrong, because I'm sure there's lots I don't know about. But it is absolutely essential for graduates to actually have some workplace experience. Because, you know, when young people graduate, whether it's from a university or from other institutions, and they zip along, you know, to their employer, they perceive that they're pretty special by now, you know. They don't like starting from the ground and, you know, having to learn on the job. They think they know stuff. So they're quite difficult employees if they don't get that they've got a lot to learn yet to be useful in the workplace.
Right. And Dom, we've just heard about universities, but what's happening in the non-university part of the sector? And are you doing it any better?
It depends on the mission and vision. I mean, at our college, our vision is to be Australia's leader of career-focused education, and 100% of our students graduate with industry experience. We have a rigorous 9-month internship, mostly paid. A couple of disciplines, sports, there's a lot of volunteerism, but for the business programs we offer, this 9-month internship in the middle of the degree. But then that's in our roots. We came from the old Diplôme Suisse in the early days, and you would have known that at AIHS with the Carnell. This was based on the EHL École Hôtelière Lausanne model, where way back you would have 6 months of service training, six months in industry, 6 months in the kitchen, 6 months in industry, 6 months of management, whatever that was, and then 6 months in industry. And at Lausanne, which is ranked number 1 in the world with Carnell in hotelieri, the graduates would go on to become GMs. And so if you have that in the DNA of the college, then you live it every day with your students, this career focus.
And Dom, you're talking about more specifically the vocational skills there, but how about the skills that we need in the future? As Kate was saying, the skills like leadership, teamwork, communications, are they being handled well in the non-university part of the sector?
Well, in order to be successful in industry, and we have a team of 6 for our small university looking after when the students go out, you have to have this infused through your curriculum. And that's just I think for most of the schools of our ilk, Southern Cross Hotel School and some of the other smaller business colleges, this is just the norm. It's got to be there.
Mark, you view this from outside of the higher education part of the education spectrum as you regulate the vet sector. But from your perspective, how do you see the higher education sector performing in meeting the needs of employers?
If I could contrast the two sectors, and the vocational education and training sector has gone through very substantial transformation over the last 20 years. It is now generally regarded as an industry-led system. Private provision of vocational training far exceeds the provision of that through public institutions. Most people are not aware that 20 years ago TAFE dominated the provision of publicly funded vocational training, and it was delivered largely to the traditional trades. Employers said that they wanted the system to change to be able to meet their needs. We used to provide service largely to those traditional trades and ignore, outside of hairdressing, we ignored the services sector. And now the services sector dominates our economy. In most states, about 80% of industry value add comes from the services sector in those states, and you've seen a very significant shift in the delivery of service, both by provider, being about 60% of the market delivered by the private sector, and just a bit more than 17% delivered through the traditional TAFE system. But you've also seen a very substantial shift to delivery in the services sector. Because a lot of that growth in delivery in vocational training has been employer-led, there's a much greater emphasis on the employability skills, the foundation skills that are required of students. I don't suggest that it's done perfectly or even very, very well in all institutions, in all courses, but there's certainly much greater attention to it. And more than half of Australia's employers are involved with the vocational education and training system, either with mandatory qualifications required for employment within their industry, or they choose to have vocational qualifications for people who enter their industries. And having that industry-led system makes it quite different from the higher education system. It's different in focus. We heard from the speaker earlier about the competency-based versus time served. Australia has gone further than any comparable nation in removing time served from vocational training, and it is a competency-based system. I would argue we've gone too far in relation to completely removing duration from our system, and that's something that's subject to an ongoing conversation at the present time. But it is driven by competency, it is driven by meeting the needs of industry, and as the needs of industry change, the training packages that support that industry change.
Yeah. Natasha, you're representing students here on the panel. So what do students see? Are they seeing that institutions are serving their needs in helping them learn the skills that are going to be important in finding jobs over the next few decades?
Before I express my perspective, I first want to really thank TEXA for the opportunity to be on this panel and for integrating student perspectives into the panels. I think it's really refreshing to see that. So to answer your question, students are very concerned about employability and the connections and skills they need to make throughout the duration of their courses in order to actually get a job once they finish. Students are always asking for opportunities. At orientation week, students will come and say, what workshops are there? Are there interview skills workshops? What can we do to become more job ready? I think the difficulty is actually in a bit of a lack of opportunity. So students really have a large appetite for things like internships, but you get a lot of students applying for the same internship. So I think it's a bit of a supply and demand problem where the cream of the crop are getting that experience they need, but the majority of students are certainly want that experience and want to build up those skills, but are struggling to find the opportunities to do so.
Thanks, Natasha. And now we'll go to a question from a student in the audience. And the question is, as a student that has gotten a trade through the TAFE system, I'm now an engineering student. Could universities and industries work together to move a degree like engineering towards a more apprentice type system? And I think this question is alluding to the fact that we are now seeing the advent of higher apprenticeships, as they're called. They're certainly operating in the UK, and there's some experimentation occurring with them in Australia, where a university course is more like an apprenticeship in that it involves practical hands-on training at every level. And ought we be seeing more of that in courses like engineering, which have a very strong vocational emphasis?
If I could jump in there. I mean, I'm a German fan, be it Bayern Munich or the applied university system there. And there was some discussion yesterday about the categories in Australia and the review that's coming up. But the old UK polytechnic system as well, with the third year in industry. And as you mentioned, degree apprenticeships. It's very interesting in the German system. Every student is sponsored at the Hochschulen. Every student at this university level is sponsored by a company. Baden-Württemberg University has 34,000 students and 9,000 partner companies. It's just at a different level. If you want to be a professor there, you better have 5 years top executive level experience in a company. It doesn't count how many journal articles that you've put into journals. It's whether you've walked the walk there. And I just want to tell a quick story to end here. When I was up in Malaysia, our neighbouring university, Taylor's University, had business engineering students in from Germany on a study tour, and the goal was to see how you could build a subsidiary in the Malaysian market. And I remember the program manager speaking to one of the students, and the students were from Ingolstadt in Munich, and said, "What are you studying?" And the student replied, "I work for Siemens." And that just showed you where the students' head was. So when we're talking, the question is a good question. I think we need to just engage a lot more with industry to make sure that industry sponsors, you know.
Yeah.
And industry,
Okay.
and industry and business is really interested in doing that. But I think the dilemma comes is that Australia is predominantly a nation of small to medium-sized businesses, and a lot of those companies in Germany are middle-sized businesses. They're Mittelstand. You know, they're not necessarily all Siemens and other scenarios. So it's possible to do it at the middle-sized business, and even in some of the small businesses. But there's not a natural method of being able to have those sorts of partnerships at this stage. The answer to the question is, if we're really planning to be flexible and provide the sort of training and outcomes that people want, then we've got to be able to be flexible enough to be able to deliver in the way that the question is spoken about. And I'll give you an example of some of the problems that exist. This was a particular case we were dealing with in the small to medium business space that I deal with. A husband and wife team owned a restaurant. In fact, the husband was a graduate of yours. Anyway, but his wife has a marketing degree. She decided that she wanted to do a TAFE course in professional cookery because they kept losing their chefs all the time. And, you know, there was a good reason to do that. But because she had a university degree, the only way that she could, in the city that she was in, and I don't know if this is everywhere, do a professional cookery course was to be a full fee paying private student. So because she was going down, or I don't think it is down, but from uni to TAFE, she wasn't allowed to, she couldn't operate except as a full fee paying student. Now, for those people who know much about restaurants, that was a really difficult situation for them financially, which is sort of not flexible, is it?
Okay. Okay.
Can I just
Is
pick
that a
up
help
on-
loans problem, Kate?
Sorry?
Is that a help loans problem?
The dilemma was the actual cost
Right, okay.
of the course generally and their capacity to pay it back over time, because she already had a HECS debt for her initial space, but it was full fee paying. It wasn't what, you know, other students would pay. Sorry, Mark.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up a point that Kate made, and I know she wasn't being derogatory in saying moving down to the vet system, but there are misunderstandings about the interaction between the two systems. The vet system is about 10 times the size of the higher education system in Australia, and about 10 times more people go from higher education to vet than go from vet to higher education. And that's consistently been the case over the last couple of decades. So people are going to universities to enhance their education. There's a lot of emphasis. We heard earlier it's 40% of the cohort going into universities. The other 60% are not. But many going into universities are then going into vocational training to gain the skills to gain employment. And there is a very significant set of differences between the two systems and their approach that mean that there isn't a hierarchy in a traditional sense, and much larger numbers of people go from higher education to vocational training to get the employability skills. Going back to your question, which talked about engineering taking up apprenticeship style systems, and there's a lot of attention given to vocational placements or internships, and there's a lot of demand for it. We already have government requiring work placements as part of the vocational training system. In childcare, for example, it's a requirement for training, but it's not well managed because the training provider doesn't necessarily take responsibility for oversighting the work placement, and the student is dumped on the employer who takes no responsibility for the student's work placement really, because they are not their employee and they don't have a relationship with that student. It's not necessarily a prospective future employee, it's a student with an institution. So if we're to shift more in the vocational training system or more in the higher education system to an apprenticeship-based or an intern-based or a work placement-based system, there has to be a more sophisticated understanding of the responsibilities of the respective parties to ensure that it's not just an extra pair of hands or somebody who's a third wheel in an employment arrangement. If there's going to be a vocational placement, it's got to be real.
What's the student view of this, Natasha?
Certainly I agree with the implication of the question that engineering and fields that have a very clear pathway should be more integrated with an internship type system. Some universities do currently require that students in courses like engineering and law and teaching have to do internships, or not exactly internships, but work placements. My concern is the execution of this. So you do hear real horror stories of, for example, students on teaching placement who are given stapling to do. So they're not actually getting a learning experience out of it. And certainly they're not going to get a job out of it. What I would like to see is for students who have a very clear pathway, for example, a student who wants to become a teacher, it would be an amazing initiative if students could, say, apply directly to a school and then say, I want to work for you, can I gain experience and do my degree at the same time? And then if you like me, you'll hire me at the end. I think that would solve a lot of problems.
I think Natasha makes a good point there. And if you're going to place students for rigorous internship periods, you have to give the whole gamut of care. That means before they go out working with the companies, sometimes it goes wrong. I mean, we've placed so many thousands of students into internship, it could go wrong with the supervisor. You have to visit the site. There needs to be this complete level of care. I remember as a student back years ago at State University of New York, you could take a sort of summer internship and literally you just had to bring the letter from the employer that you'd done this many hours at the end of the summer, and then you got the thumbs up. But the level of care from inception throughout and then reflecting on the experience, we need to be there every step of the way. If something goes wrong in the Whitsundays with one of our students, maybe sexual harassment or something, it happens every once in a while. Our folk are on the plane that night to sort it out. And when you begin to realize that you embrace that sort of engagement, then it's no wonder why the students, 90% of them have jobs before graduation or have career paths started before graduation. But it's got to be to that level.
Now, our panel is here to be challenged, and you've asked some challenging questions, and so here we go. So, employers also have a responsibility to make graduates work ready. It's a continuing lifelong process. So, is it reasonable to expect a uni to make a graduate work ready? Is it really the education provider's responsibility?
If the education provider wants them to get a job, yes,
Right.
they have a role
Okay,
in,
I like that answer.
in this space.
Righto. One more. Given that industry is one of the major beneficiaries of higher education, should students be asked to contribute to the cost? I think the implication is that industry should pay for your education. What do you think, Natasha?
I think if a business hires a student before they've undertaken their degree, then certainly that would be a good way to do things. In terms of industry bearing the cost, I'm not too sure. I think that might be something Kate might have more to say about.
Industry wears a chunk of the cost anyway, in terms of on the job training in particular, skills that are needed in a particular scenario. Industry will pay if they're getting a benefit. So there are people who are actually value adding to their business, and they'll work really hard to keep those people in their businesses. So the great challenge here is, where's the chicken and where's the egg here?
Okay. And here's one more question which challenges our groupthink. Isn't it partly the responsibility of students to drive their own capabilities through work experience, volunteering and part-time work? As a student, I don't want to pay a university to teach me how to communicate. So in other words, they're saying, I think they're saying, the universities are no good at this and I don't want to pay for it, so just stay out of the area, thanks very much.
No, I think we need to teach, we were talking about soft skills earlier and to communicate, but we also need to put on experiences. The student that's with us at the TEXA conference that's come down from Sydney, Hannah, on the weekend I went into the Volley Fest volleyball games on beach volleyball and Manly Beach, and there she was resplendent in her Volleyball Australia shirt and placing the people into the corporate boxes and making sure that they were fine. And I said, how did you get that gig? And it was advertised at the college and it's a volunteer experience, so I signed up for it. And so I think, again, it's the job of the colleges, one, to teach communication, definitely, but to have this plethora of opportunities for students to take them up. Some students are students. Some will take them up and some won't, and that's all we can offer, you know. But that's where we've got to get to.
Right, and so a few more ideas that afloat. No?
One of the questions is, where does the responsibility lie in many of these things? Often it's one institution saying it rests with somebody else. And what employers are looking for largely is, when we talk about some of these employability skills, they're life skills. They are life skills that you would expect of graduates from our secondary school system. They ought to be life skills that people can reasonably expect from our higher education system and from our vocational education system. And if we have graduates of our higher education system who are coming out without those skills that will enable them to function normally in a work environment, then there's failure in a number of levels within our system. And I do think that universities have a responsibility. They can't say, or should not say, I shouldn't say they can't say, they should not say that it's not our problem, that we're here to do our job. There is a substantial part of public funding that goes into higher education delivery, notwithstanding the fact that many are dependent upon foreign source income from overseas students. The reality is there's very substantial amounts of public money that go in there for a variety of activities, but having graduates that come out without the appropriate life skills is an indictment on the system. It would be an indictment on our secondary school system, and it's an indictment on our vocational system if they come out of structured training without those skills.
Right. And here's an idea which comes from the floor. Many learners and students interested in seeking jobs and careers, and it's why they go for tertiary education. And so why don't universities or learning institutions provide learning where students learn, train and earn all in one hub? Is this possible? Now, Dom, I can see you're smiling there, and you must have an idea about this.
Well, we call this the triple win situation. Win, win, win. It's not in a hub, but you know, we have industry come to us. We're very lucky to have one of the founding family members drive an incredible scholarship program, and for our little college, you know, we've given out $1 million this year, but 10% of that comes from industry where for example, Accor hotels will come in, pick the student for the last year of their studies, sponsor them, so the student wins, the college wins, and industry wins. As far as combining that into one hub, I think when you visit the applied universities in Germany, you get a sense that it's one hub, and we've got to move towards that, you know.
Can I think it is possible, but it does require that partnership between businesses, you know, and the institution, you know, whoever that might be. And it needs to be ongoing because, you know, when students first start with you, and I've had lots over the years, I tell you what, they're not terribly useful. In fact, the amount of time and effort they take, you know, to get them up to speed is significantly higher than the actual benefit to the business. So what you want is you want people who come back all the time. So you want not just a few weeks here and a few weeks there. You might want people who will come back and work for the 3 months, you know, every Christmas, or come and do a 6-month internship. Where the issue becomes a problem is work placement, you know, where it's a few weeks. It's just not useful from a business perspective. It might be useful from a student perspective, but it just doesn't cut it with the business.
Would this be useful from a student perspective, Natasha?
To have everything in one place?
Yes.
I'm not too sure about the practicalities of that. Certainly that question made me think about the needs of international students in particular. So they're paying a lot of money and they expect to receive good value out of that. So often international students will say things like, I've come all the way here and there's not enough opportunities for me. My university is not providing me with these jobs and these experiences which I thought I would be getting. So I think certainly for especially international students who might have a little bit more trouble navigating the system here, it would be really good to provide a bit more support, more linkages between universities and businesses, particularly for that cohort of students.
Yeah.
Can I just add something that I think sometimes we forget? The reason the partnership is necessary from a business perspective with universities is a lot of the on-cost issues. Business obviously has to pay people and should for internships and so on, but where there's a partnership, the university, where it is an intern, a planned internship, the university or training entity maintains things like workers' comp, those sorts of issues, which are huge costs, particularly for small to medium businesses. And so it ends up being a real partnership.
You're right. Here's a broader question, which I think looks to the heart of what is going on, where we expect students to have more and more qualifications if they are to find a job. And the questioner says, certain industries and firms seem to be increasing the qualifications and experience required for entry-level roles. Has industry gone too far in the expectations of graduates? And what is the role of the sector in managing these expectations? Dom, I can see you've got an answer.
We speak to, you know, when I was finishing off my doctoral studies, I got to interview general managers around the world, and they just say, we ask for that, now we're asking at this level, now we're asking at that level. And so there's been a sort of credential up creep from the diploma to the associate degree to the degree, and they ask and they still get, you know. But before, you know, they would be asking for diploma level students. Now they can ask for degree.
Sure, and the question is, are these useful? Are we just asking students to spend more time and more money in getting qualifications that are not really paying off?
Well, then you've got to balance the nexus of what industry really needs. Some industries are very traditional. Again, some of the GMs will say, no matter which university they come from, I stick them on the front desk for 6 weeks, see how they go, and then I'll decide on what their managerial path will be. Again, I've been to many academic conferences where the faculty are sitting around saying, we need more engagement from industry, but and it's almost divisive, you know, the industry don't help us. No, we've got to just bring it together and push it and live it if we're really going to give the students the best chance. When students come to colleges of our ilk, there is behaviour modification of a certain sense, positive behaviour modification that takes place in the way they dress and in their attitude, and that's because industry is in our ear about it.
Can I say I think we do overtrain? There you go.
Right.
In lots of
Okay.
scenarios, I think that's not the case everywhere, but there are a range of areas where we're requiring sort of master's degrees, and we'll talk about, and someone will be really cross with me for saying this, but in say the nursing space, for a practice nurse or for nursing in a range of areas, we're requiring a master's degree. Now, is that absolutely necessary? It might be in some circumstances, but it might not be in others. So, do we just keep asking for another chunk, for another bit of study? And does that actually make somebody better at their job?
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay. What do you think, Natasha?
From
the student point of view.
perspective, I think, well, we'd all be very aware of the issue of educational inflation, and higher degrees certainly do have a lot of value in signalling to employers, but in terms of the extra knowledge that you might get in that time, it might not have been necessary to do the job which you eventually end up getting. So I think that's, echoing some of the other comments made on the panel, that perhaps these higher degrees are not worth all of the time and money spent on them by students.
Right, and here I'll go to a question that is from the audience, which is that we have seen a rise in micro type of degrees and credentials. Have they got a place here, and will they actually take the place of some qualifications that we have now, particularly in the postgraduate space, as they're much faster and they're certainly cheaper?
One of the features of the vocational education and training system is that registered training organisations can issue qualifications or statements of attainment or statements of competence. And we're seeing increasing numbers where both employers and students are not looking for the qualification, they're looking for components of the qualification. They need something right here, right now. The employer needs something right here, right now. So you are seeing a disaggregation of credentials. So it's like in any generalisation, there will be a perception that we're asking for everybody to have a master's degree, which for the overwhelming majority of employment in Australia is not the case. And at the other end of the spectrum, retailers want people who are going to work in retail to understand retail maths. And by saying that, I mean, if you hand over a $50 bill and you're expecting to get change for a $34.55 purchase, very large numbers of those people have no idea, even if the till tells them what the amount of change is, they have no idea as to how to do the most efficient disaggregation of the change in terms of returning it. They're real life experiences that happen even now. So we don't have excessive expectations across the board. It is a marketplace, so if people can lift the quality of their potential employees and they expect higher levels of graduation from those employees, then that's the marketplace in which they operate. Atlassian, one of our homegrown major tech-based companies, says it is dependent upon 457 visas to bring in appropriately qualified ICT engineering people because it cannot staff its business from graduates of Australian universities. So both ends of the spectrum, I think that there are demands for higher levels of credential to meet increasing demands for higher levels of expertise. At the other end, we still deliver non-basic skills that are required for employment.
And there's also been a question, which I think is an important one, which is how well are universities and other providers structuring what they do to meet the education needs that we are seeing now. And the question specifically is, we are assessing via exams still, and how useful are exams in assessing the types of skills that students need and employers want. How realistic is a 3-hour exam if you are trying to test how well a student is going to do in the workplace?
Well, if you're an employer, you'd say it's meaningless.
Right?
But employers are not experts in pedagogy, in education and training, and they don't pretend to be. The vocational training system is much less reliant on exams and is highly reliant on demonstrated competence. And employers who are involved in that, and the apprenticeship and traineeship system is an important part, but it's by no means the whole of the vocational education and training system. Demonstrated competence is a more meaningful measure for employers than exams, because you don't sit exams per se, although in some workplaces every day is like sitting a 3-hour exam.
And Kate, as a former employer representative, what's your take?
Look, I expect it's a mix of the two. You know, the benefits of exams are that there's a point in time where you've proven to have a level of knowledge, and that's really useful. You know, in many scenarios, particularly in some of the professions, you know, like pharmacy, like so on, that you understand that you have a level of information. But the days of straight exams hopefully are gone, and they're mixed with experiential learning, with learning more broadly in the tutorial space, in a whole range of other areas. I have to say I loved exams because I was really good at 24-hour straight cram, do exam, pass it, 2 weeks later, have no idea what it was about.
And that's the problem, isn't it?
That was the problem, absolutely. But anyway, there you go. It is the problem, and it's certainly on its own not okay.
Right. What's the student view, Natasha?
Most students don't like exams. I think we're probably all aware of that. But in terms of the value of exams, certainly the reason why they're used is because they're relatively cheap to administer to a very large cohort of students. But having said that, they do have some value. It just depends what you're looking for. So you might not care if a student can do differential equations in 3 hours, but you might care that they have the capacity to cram the 24-hour period before. You might care that they are able to perform well under pressure. So it depends what skill you're really looking for.
Righto.
I feel I'm just glad to be here at the TEXA conference. I was just having flashbacks there. I thought I was in a learning and teaching committee meeting where we were going to talk about over-assessment. So I'm finished with that.
Right. Okay, well, we're about to wind up, but I'm going to end on a question that I'm sure that you'd like me to ask me. Ask Deb, it's on top of the list here. At what point will industry consider investment in humanities as a means of enhancing workplace readiness? Should we teach more humanities, and what is important about them, if anything, for employers?
I don't think employers judge negatively or positively necessarily an investment in the humanities.
Sure.
They're looking for the skills that are required in the workplace, and they're looking for
But do you
rounded
see
individuals.
specific
And well, you know,
skills and characteristics in graduates that come from studying the humanities?
I think that there is a distortion in the view that somehow humanities are not viewed positively by employers, when I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think that a change in the nature of the workplace, and particularly an enhancement or an expansion of the workplace focusing on the services sector, many of the issues associated with the humanities are very much a counterpoint feature with the nature of the workplace. I've always wondered why all of the people in the humanities area have such a chip on their shoulder in relation to, and I know the question came earlier, but I've been involved in international research projects. I ran the largest bilateral research engagement that Australia has with another nation. I was involved in the EU research communities, and it was always the humanities who felt as though somehow they were being unfairly treated in the scheme of things. And maybe we should ask the humanities people why.
Well,
In my current... Look, I absolutely agree with Mark on this. In my current role, I need people who can work in teams, who can communicate, who can write, and who can think. I don't care what degree they've got.
right. And as a student, Natasha, what do you think?
Well, as a sociology student, so from someone who...
The right person to answer this question.
I can see both sides of it. To answer why students in the arts and humanities might have a chip on their shoulder, I think there's a lot of mixed messages. So from prospective employers, it actually isn't usually a negative message. It's, the skills that you develop are valued. But from other students and from people who aren't necessarily working in the industries that you're looking at, you do get a lot of, so what are you going to do? As if they're the first person that's thought to ask you this. So I think there is a lot of negative messaging, but it's not coming from the people who matter.
Can I just
Thank you very
reiterate
much.
that? Because
And
there's
on
really
that
two,
note-
there's two questions there. The question implies that humanities are required for all disciplines in order for successful employment and industry embeddedness. I think that's what the question's really asking. Statistically, the humanities are very successful at getting graduates into industry. In fact, much more successful than many other disciplines. And that's something we don't sell very well, and we probably should. And it's not a question of, therefore, of needing to have a chip on the shoulder, because we do that very well.
If we go back to this morning's first presentation about the US system, I'm a product of the state university system in America, and we had our general education component, which included taking some humanities, and definitely for groundedness into the future, of course. It's a fantastic experience, you know? And a great foundation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. On
Thank
that
you, Tim.
note, please thank our 4 panellists and our 5th one.
Thanks a lot to Tim as well. That was really, really, really well handled in a complex area.